I'm going to show you a classic encounter between Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer, two chess legends. Now, this game has historical significance because it was the first time that they ever faced each other across the chessboard. It was played in Argentina in 1960. Spassky was 23, Fischer was 17 years old. But also, this game is significant because, well, you can see it's a King's Gambit on the board, and after this game, Fischer published an article in 1961 claiming to have refuted the King's Gambit with the move d6. Anyway, that's an open question. But in this game, Fischer played g5. Well, this is typical Fischer, really uncompromising. He wants to try and hang on to that pawn. h4, the Kieseritzky variation. Now, in my DVD, I have it to hand. There we are, my repertoire with the King's Gambit. I actually recommend the Kvada variation here with knight c3. But h4, well, this is, you could say, one of the main lines, Kieseritzky, forcing the pawn forward. Knight e5, the point is that White has now made those pawns a little bit vulnerable, but then again, you could say that White's whole king side is vulnerable here. And here, d4, I mean, this is one of the main lines. And here, Fischer just took on e4, which is, the accepted move. Nowadays, well, knight c6 is known as quite a challenge to this variation. This is, I think, first played by Ivanchuk. In any case, knight e4 in this game. Bishop takes f4. Now, black is a pawn up, but White does have compensation here in the form of control over this f4 square. You can see in this position, black would actually probably rather like it if this pawn were put back on g7. Because the pawn is advanced, that means all these squares down the f-file are a bit weaker. That gives White compensation, in particular control of that f4 square. And here, well, c3, just protecting that pawn is the main move. And Fischer thinks that, well, White has compensation, but black is okay there as well. Well, I think black is just better, frankly, if black plays correctly. But in any case, Spassky played knight c3, bringing a piece into the game. Well, to me, that feels a very logical move. And Fischer exchanged off. And, well, very typical Fischer. He wants to try and seize the initiative. He's using that c-pawn to break down White's centre. But there is a downside to that now White has a little bit more time to bring pieces into the game. Spassky played bishop e2, all about quick development. Gives up the pawn in the middle and castles. And here, you shouldn't be too greedy. If you play a move like h5, then that pawn could later on be weak. So, well, Fischer understands that. He brings out a piece instead, just protecting that pawn. Bishop takes pawn, so Spassky gets one back. Fischer castles. Bishop takes bishop on c8, rook takes c8, and queen g4. Now, you can see that bishop h6 is threatened. And, I mean, this highlights black's problem in this position. If we could sort of put a pawn on g6 and just block out the king side, of course, black would have a huge advantage. But even though black is how many pawns up? Well, at the moment, only one pawn up. Spassky does have a little bit of compensation here in the shape of black's slightly weakened king side. And White has very active pieces. Fischer thought afterwards he should have perhaps played king h8, but instead he went for f5, knocking the queen back. And that means that bishop h6 can always be met by, well, for example, moving the queen to the second rack to defend. So Fischer played f5 so that he could grab another pawn here. So at the moment he's actually 2 pawns up. And if Spassky takes this pawn here, then the rook will come up the board and start a counterattack. So Spassky, 2 pawns down, just plays his last piece into the middle. Very calm. And you can see every single one of White's pieces is in the game, and that makes a nice impression. Here, Fischer played King h8. Queen d7 was recommended afterwards to connect the rooks. But King h8 is also okay. And now, well, some have said that bishop takes d6 is a better move. King h1 nudges the king out of the way. And, well, you can see how already black has to take care. For example, if that pawn advances to d5, then knight c5 allows that knight into e6. So rook g8 looks very sensible. Just starting to get some pressure on this file. Bishop takes pawn on d6. So now Spassky's only 1 pawn down. Bishop f8, good move from Fischer. So he's unmasked the rook, which now attacks the queen. Bishop e5 check. And Fischer very happily exchanges off that bishop. Queen takes knight check. And rook g7. And rook takes f5, so lots of pieces getting cleared off the board, and now Fischer is able to activate his queen. Queen takes pawn on h4 check, king g1. So we should take stock at this moment because lots of exchanges. This is a very unusual position because normally you have a pawn structure that the pieces sort of play around. Perhaps a pawn in the middle that anchors a minor piece, or a pawn structure that you're trying to break down, or maybe force a passed pawn through. But here, well, there's no kind of central pawn structure to speak of, and yet there are so many pieces on the board, in particular, of course, the major pieces, the queen and the 2 rooks. So that means that both kings are a little bit exposed as well. Only 1 pawn in front of each king. In particular, I think that the black king is more exposed, that queen on e5 pinning the rook on g7. So it's a very unusual situation, even though Fischer is a pawn up here. In fact, that pawn doesn't give any kind of influence over the center. And you can see that Spassky is very well centralized here. Here, Fischer played the queen to g4, threatening mate. Well, it's hard to believe that a move like that is a mistake, but it was. After the game, Spassky thought that, well, said to Fischer, queen g3, that's the move. And it's true that this endgame, well, with a pawn up for black, must give black some winning chances. But I would say Fischer was probably reluctant to go in for this because, you know, White's pieces are very well centralized here, and that bishop at the moment doesn't do much. Fischer went queen g4, threatening mate. Rook f2 defends the pawn on g2. Bishop e7, threatening bishop h4. You can understand why Fischer went for this. But now problems start, and here Fischer saw that he could make a draw by perpetual, like this. Well, at least repetition of position, rather. Rook e1, and the queen goes back here. White actually doesn't have anything better here. And queen d1 again. But instead, Fischer wanted more. He played queen g5. So now he's thinking, yeah, that endgame looks like a good idea. Queen d4 from Spassky is an excellent move, probably underestimated by Fischer. Maintains the pin. And it's just very hard for black to do anything at all in this position. In fact, black is still okay here if the bishop drops back, and probably it's still balanced, but instead Fischer played rook f8, which looks like such an understandable move. Fischer wants to exchange off pieces to relieve the pressure. He wants, well, not just relieving the pressure, he wants to try and get pressure on g2, of course. but he had overlooked Spassky's reply, rook e5. It is hard to imagine that this is a winning move, but black has no good response here. So rook e5 threatens the queen, that's the first thing. If the queen goes back to g6, we take the bishop. Remember, there's a pin here. If the queen goes to h4, we play rook takes rook, check, deflecting the bishop, and then we take the queen. If instead bishop f6 to block, and that looks like the most plausible move, but queen d6 hits the rook, the queen is still attacked, white wins. So after rook e5, basically that queen is overloaded. It has to keep hold of the bishop. It can't do so. Fischer tried rook d8, then queen e4, queen still attacked, queen h4, he's hanging on to the bishop, and now rook f4 just overloads the queen. The queen has to keep protecting the bishop. It's attacked, and when it moves away, rook takes e7, wins a piece for white and wins the game. So after rook f4, Fischer resigned. Extraordinary. And, well, according to Bronstein, Fischer ran back to his room and in tears after this game. Bronstein actually tried to console him. But Fischer, well, he was such a hard worker, and he obviously resolved to try and solve the problem of the King's Gambit. And next year in 1961, he published this article, A Bust to the King's Gambit, where he claimed that d6 was the correct move, a high-class waiting move, according to Fischer. Well, things aren't so clear, actually, and white has ways to stir things up in that variation. But anyway, really a historic game, the first time that Spassky and Fischer played. And yeah, Spassky was brave enough to play the King's Gambit. Thanks for watching.